Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach when the loudspeaker buzzed, and a voice called her name. "Sarah Williams, please report to the principal's office." Heads turned toward her, eyes filled with curiosity, some with amusement. A few students whispered, nudging each other with playful smirks. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment, though she kept her expression neutral, clutching her notebook tighter. She hadn't done anything wrong, of that she was sure. In the hallway, she took a deep breath, smoothing down her curly hair nervously. This has to be a misunderstanding. As she walked, the stares followed her. Staff, students, even the janitor, like a walk of shame she hadn't earned. When she reached the door to Robert Jenkins' office, it felt heavier than it ever had before. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with quiet authority. Principal Jenkins, a tall man with sharp, graying features, sat behind his desk, tapping a pen absently against a file. His cold blue eyes flicked up as Sarah entered, and standing by his side was Miss Collins, her math teacher, a woman whose forced politeness masked a simmering impatience. "Have a seat, Miss Williams," Jenkins said curtly, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Sarah swallowed hard and sat, placing her notebook on her lap. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk. "No, sir." Sarah kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded. Jenkins exhaled through his nose, as if annoyed she didn't already know. "Miss Collins tells me that you were disruptive and disrespectful during her class today. Specifically, she claims you made a snide remark when she corrected you." Sarah blinked, stunned. I don't know what she's talking about. I didn't say anything." Miss Collins interrupted sharply. "Sarah, don't play innocent. You know exactly what you said." "I didn't say anything," Sarah repeated, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to stay composed. Jenkins raised a hand to silence her. "Enough. I won't tolerate dishonesty, Miss Williams. Miss Collins has no reason to lie about this." Sarah felt the sting of those words, as if her integrity had been tossed aside without a second thought. "But Enough." His tone was final, like a judge slamming down a gavel. "I'm suspending you for 2 days, effective immediately." The words hit her like a slap. "What?" she whispered, eyes wide. "You're suspending me? But I didn't do anything wrong." "Sarah, you need to understand that actions have consequences," Jenkins said, his voice low and condescending, as if she were a child incapable of comprehension. "This isn't about what you think you did or didn't do. It's about learning respect." Humiliation washed over her like a wave. She could feel Miss Collins watching her, arms folded, with a smug look of triumph barely concealed beneath her neutral expression. "You'll use these 2 days to reflect on your behavior," Jenkins continued. "And perhaps next time, you'll think twice before speaking out of turn." "But I didn't." "You can stop right there, Miss Williams," Jenkins interrupted coldly. "The decision is final. You may leave." Sarah sat frozen for a moment, disbelief swirling in her mind. Every instinct told her to keep fighting, to make him listen, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Jenkins had already made up his mind. "They always do," she thought bitterly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jenkins added, leaning back in his chair as if the matter were closed. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. She stood slowly, gripping her notebook with white-knuckled fingers, and turned toward the door. As she opened it, she heard Miss Collins mutter under her breath, "These kids think they can do whatever they want." The words cut deep, like an invisible wound. She glanced back over her shoulder at the 2 adults, hoping, foolishly, that one of them would change their mind, that someone would say, "Wait, let's talk this through." But all she saw were 2 pairs of indifferent eyes, their minds already on the next thing. When she stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her, the weight of humiliation settled on her chest like a stone. And the walk back through the school felt even longer this time. Whispers chased her down the corridors, spreading like wildfire. "Did you hear? Sarah Williams got suspended. Isn't she the one who's, never in troubles?" She probably had it coming. Sarah clenched her jaw, each comment twisting the knife deeper. By the time she reached her locker, her hands were trembling. She stuffed her books inside without care, slamming the door shut. She just needed to get out of there, away from the stairs, away from the whispers. This can't be happening. The walk home was a blur. When she finally stepped through the front door, her father's voice called out from the kitchen. "Hey, kiddo, how was—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her face. "What happened?" Sarah dropped her backpack onto the floor and sank into a chair at the dining table, her composure unraveling all at once. "I got suspended," she said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Marcus froze for a moment, processing what she'd just said. "Suspended? For what?" "Miss Collins said I was being disrespectful, but I swear, Dad, I didn't do anything." Marcus's expression darkened, not with anger, but with something colder, more deliberate. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me everything," he said calmly, his voice steady in that way it always was before a storm. Sarah recounted every detail: the false accusation, the humiliation in the office, the way Jenkins dismissed her without a second thought. Marcus listened silently, his face unreadable. When she finished, he stood up without a word and walked toward his bedroom. Sarah wiped her eyes, confused, until she heard the soft click of his closet door opening. A minute later, Marcus emerged, dressed in full military uniform. His Air Force insignia gleamed under the soft kitchen light. "Dad?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus adjusted the collar of his uniform, smoothing it down with precise movements. Then he turned to her, his expression calm but determined. "We're going to get some answers," he said, his voice steady and unshakable. And just like that, the humiliation Sarah had felt began to melt, replaced by something warmer, the knowledge that her father had her back. No matter what, the ride to the school was quiet, but it wasn't a calm silence. It was the kind of silence that stretched tight, like the moments before a storm hits. Sarah sat beside her father, fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. She glanced at Marcus, whose face was a mask of calm, though she knew the gears were turning behind his eyes. When they reached the school parking lot, Marcus cut the engine and sat still for a moment, looking at the building with a quiet intensity. "You okay?" he asked without looking at her. Sarah nodded, though her stomach was a twisted knot. "I need you to trust me, okay?" Marcus continued, finally turning toward her. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm here to make sure you get the respect you deserve." Sarah gave a small, tight nod, though the weight of the morning still sat heavily on her shoulders. Marcus stepped out of the car, the click of his polished boots on the pavement echoing with quiet authority. Sarah followed, heart pounding in her chest, as they made their way toward the entrance. The glass door swung open, and they stepped inside. The hum of conversations in the front office came to an abrupt halt as the staff noticed Marcus in his full Air Force uniform. The receptionist, a woman with curly blonde hair and a nameplate that read Mrs. Alvarez, straightened in her seat. Her eyes widened slightly as Marcus approached the desk. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to see Principal Jenkins." Mrs. Alvarez gave him a nervous smile. Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," Marcus replied smoothly, his tone unwavering. "But I think I want to make time for this." Mrs. Alvarez swallowed and picked up the phone. She spoke in a hushed voice, throwing furtive glances toward Marcus and Sarah as she informed Jenkins of their arrival. "Please have a seat," she said, gesturing toward a row of chairs. Marcus didn't sit. He stood tall, hands clasped behind his back, his presence filling the room with a quiet power. Sarah stood beside him, shoulders hunched, trying to make herself as small as possible under the weight of the curious stares. A door to the side opened, and Miss Collins stepped out, her sharp gaze landing on Marcus and Sarah. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this about?" "I'm here to discuss my daughter's suspension," Marcus said, meeting her gaze without flinching. Miss Collins crossed her arms, clearly displeased. "I think the matter has already been resolved. The suspension stands." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'd like to speak with the principal directly." Before Miss Collins could respond, Jenkins appeared at the doorway to his office. He froze for a moment, his eyes locking onto Marcus. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, followed quickly by discomfort, but he masked it quickly. Lieutenant Williams, Jenkins said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. I wasn't expecting you. Marcus's expression remained neutral. I'm sure you weren't. Jenkins stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter his office. Let's talk in here. Marcus gave Sarah a reassuring nod, and they followed Jenkins inside. As the door clicked shut behind them, the tension in the room thickened. Jenkins sat behind his desk, folding his hands neatly on the surface. I hope we can resolve this quickly. As I'm sure you understand, discipline is a crucial part of maintaining order in a school environment. Marcus didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing, his posture relaxed but commanding. I understand discipline very well, Marcus said evenly. But what I don't understand is how you came to the conclusion that my daughter deserved a suspension without any evidence. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As I mentioned earlier, Ms. Collins reported. Ms. Collins reported. Marcus interrupted, his voice still calm, but sharper now. But did you ask Sarah what happened? Did you speak to any other students? Or did you make a decision based solely on one person's word? Jenkins's jaw tightened. I trust my staff to act professionally. And yet, Marcus continued, professionalism includes fairness. Investigating claims before issuing punishment. It seems to me that fairness wasn't a priority here. Jenkins's face flushed slightly. With all due respect, Lieutenant, students need to learn that actions have consequences. Your daughter's behavior. My daughter's behavior? Marcus's voice lowered, though it carried even more weight now. Or your assumptions about her behavior? Jenkins opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the right words. I know you, Marcus said suddenly, his gaze locked on Jenkins. We've met before. You were stationed at Wright-Patterson, weren't you? Jenkins paled slightly. That was years ago? Yeah, I remember. Marcus's tone remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. I also remember why you didn't stay in the Air Force. Jenkins's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. You made a habit of throwing your weight around back then, too, Marcus said quietly. But it didn't work out for you, did it? Jenkins cleared his throat, visibly unsettled. That's not relevant to this situation. It's very relevant, Marcus replied, because it tells me everything I need to know about how you operate. And it tells me why my daughter is sitting here, suspended for something she didn't do. Jenkins looked away, shame flickering across his face. For the first time, the man who had seemed so sure of himself looked uncertain, like a boy caught in a lie. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. I'm not here to make threats, Jenkins. I just want you to do the right thing. Admit you made a mistake. Fix it. Jenkins hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Sarah. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his own pride pressing down on him. I may have acted too quickly, Jenkins muttered. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. He waited. Jenkins exhaled sharply, as if the words physically hurt. The suspension is revoked. I'll make sure it's removed from her record. Marcus nodded once, satisfied. Good. Sarah sat quietly, stunned by the shift in power dynamics. The same man who had dismissed her so easily just hours ago was now backpedaling under her father's calm but relentless gaze. As they stood to leave, Marcus paused at the door. And Jenkins, if you want to make this right, you'll look into how these decisions are being made. For everyone, not just Sarah. Jenkins nodded stiffly, his face still flushed with embarrassment. Marcus opened the door, gesturing for Sarah to follow him. As they stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter somehow, like a storm had passed, leaving behind only the quiet aftermath. And for the first time all day, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. Back in Jenkins' office, the air was thick with discomfort. Marcus remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, projecting a steady but undeniable authority. Sarah sat next to him, silent, her eyes flicking nervously between the two men. She knew her father was calm on the surface, but beneath that, he was a storm waiting to break. Jenkins cleared his throat, adjusting his posture behind the desk, trying to reassert some authority over the situation. Look, Lieutenant. Marcus, he corrected, his voice cool and precise. Let's not pretend we don't know each other. Jenkins shifted in his seat, trying to maintain composure, though the cracks in his confidence were starting to show. That was a long time ago. I don't see how it's relevant now. It's relevant because the same person you were back then, Marcus said, is still making decisions that affect other people today. Jenkins leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his hands folded tightly, as if bracing himself. I was under a lot of pressure back then. Marcus gave a small, humorless laugh. Aren't we all? He paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. But here's the thing. Pressure reveals character, Jenkins. And what I saw back then tells me everything I need to know about the way you treated my daughter today. Sarah shifted slightly in her seat, absorbing every word. She hadn't known about this history between them, whatever it was. But she could see how the conversation had shifted into something deeper, more personal. Jenkins exhaled sharply. What do you want from me, Marcus? An apology? No, Marcus said evenly. I want accountability. Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus cut him off. Do you remember Wright-Patterson? 2007. That team exercise we ran? Jenkins visibly stiffened. He remembered. That was different. No, Marcus said quietly, stepping closer to the desk. It wasn't. Sarah watched the exchange, her heart thudding in her chest. She could sense that this conversation was a turning point. Something that had been simmering beneath the surface was now coming to light. You thought Rain gave you a free pass, Marcus continued. That you could push people around and cut corners because no one would call you out. And when they did, he shook his head slowly. You folded. You couldn't handle it. Jenkins flushed with anger, but he didn't deny it. That's why you were transferred out, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. Because leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. And you never learned that. Jenkins leaned back, clearly uncomfortable, but Marcus wasn't finished. And now, here we are, Marcus said, his voice calm but cutting. You made a decision about my daughter the same way you used to make decisions back then, without thinking, without listening, without caring about the consequences. Sarah watched as Jenkins seemed to deflate under the weight of her father's words. The authority he had wielded so easily over her that morning was gone, replaced by guilt and shame. Jenkins began, but his voice faltered. He looked at Sarah for the first time, really looked at her. I may have made a mistake. You did, Marcus confirmed quietly. And now you have a chance to fix it. Jenkins exhaled slowly, as if releasing all the tension he had built up over the years. The suspension is revoked, he said, the words heavy but sincere. And I'll make sure it's removed from her record. This won't follow her. Marcus gave a small nod. Good. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward. Look, I know an apology isn't enough, but I am sorry for how I handled this, and for back then too. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a short, curt nod. It's a start. The tension in the room began to ease, though the air still felt heavy with unspoken words. Jenkins glanced between Marcus and Sarah, visibly humbled. I've been trying to do better, Jenkins admitted quietly. But sometimes, it's hard to see your own blind spots. That's why you have to keep looking, Marcus said, his voice softer now, but still steady. For your students. For yourself. Jenkins nodded slowly, as if absorbing the lesson. Marcus turned to Sarah, his expression softening. Come on, kid. Let's go. Sarah stood, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. As they moved toward the door, Jenkins cleared his throat. Marcus, he said quietly. Marcus paused, but didn't turn around. For what it's worth, Jenkins continued, you turned out to be the kind of leader I wish I could have been. Marcus didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. We all have to keep learning. And with that, they left the office, stepping out into the hallway where the air felt lighter, like a weight had finally been lifted. Sarah walked beside her father, her head held higher than it had been all day. For the first time, she felt like someone had really fought for her, not just to revoke a suspension, but to restore her dignity. And that, she realized, was worth more than any apology. The school hallway was quiet as Marcus and Sarah stepped out of Jenkins' office. The tension from earlier still lingered, but the oppressive weight was beginning to lift. As they walked down the corridor, the hum of students and staff resumed around them, but this time, the whispers felt distant, just noise in the background. Sarah glanced at her father. His face was composed, as always, but she could feel the subtle shift in his posture, like the tightly wound spring inside him had finally eased. "You okay, kid?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Sarah nodded, but her heart was still heavy. "Yeah, I think so." Marcus stopped walking and looked at her closely. "It's okay if you're not." Sarah swallowed hard, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. She had expected him to stay in military mode, stoic, focused on what needed to be done. But here he was, showing her that it was okay to feel the weight of everything. "I'm just tired," she admitted quietly. Marcus gave a small nod. "That's normal. This kind of thing," he paused, searching for the right words. "It takes more out of you than you realize." Sarah didn't respond right away. She looked down the hallway where a few students were still stealing glances at them, whispering behind cupped hands. "Everyone's going to know, aren't they?" she muttered. "Let them," Marcus said firmly. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." Sarah gave a half-hearted shrug, but Marcus wasn't letting her off the hook that easily. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said, his tone serious but kind. "This wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve what happened, and you didn't do anything wrong." For the first time, Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent the entire day trying to hold it together, but her father's words were undoing all the walls she had built. "I know," she whispered, though part of her still struggled to believe it. Marcus rested a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I've got your back. Always." Sarah blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall. But this time, they were tears of relief, not humiliation. When they reached the front office, Mrs. Alvarez shot them a nervous glance. She forced a polite smile, but it was clear she was still rattled from the earlier confrontation. "I'll be making sure the suspension is cleared from her record," she stammered as Marcus and Sarah approached the desk. Marcus gave her a curt nod. "Appreciate it." As they turned to leave, Sarah noticed Ms. Collins standing near the entrance, arms crossed over her chest. The teacher's gaze was hard and unapologetic, as if she still believed she had done the right thing. Marcus caught the look too. He stopped for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes the hardest thing is admitting when you've made a mistake." Ms. Collins gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't believe I made one." Marcus didn't push further. Instead, he held her gaze for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Come on, Sarah," he said, turning away. "We've got better places to be." The ride home was quiet again, but this time it felt different, lighter somehow. Sarah leaned her head against the window, watching the streets blur by. The knot in her chest was loosening, little by little. "Dad," she asked after a few minutes. "Yeah." "How did you know Principal Jenkins?" Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his expression didn't change. "We worked together a long time ago. Different world, different circumstances." Sarah waited, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "Back then," Marcus continued slowly, "he made some bad calls. Got transferred out because of it. Bad calls like today." Marcus gave a small nod. "Yeah, same pattern." He'd jump to conclusions, throw his weight around. It caught up to him eventually. Sarah thought about that for a moment. "Do you think he'll really change?" Marcus was quiet for a beat, his gaze steady on the road ahead. "I think he's got a choice now, and that's the best anyone can get." Sarah didn't say anything, but the thought lingered in her mind. People could change, but only if they wanted to. Later that evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee as Sarah curled up on the couch with a book. The house felt peaceful again, but the events of the day still hung in the air like a shadow. Marcus glanced toward his daughter. Watching the way she absent-mindedly flipped through the pages of her book. "You know," he said after a moment, "I've been in situations like today more times than I can count." Sarah looked up from her book, curious. "In the military?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, and out of it too. It's not easy standing up to people like Jenkins, but it's necessary." Sarah set the book down, her brow furrowed. "How do you do it?" "Stay calm, Marcus gave a small smile. "Practice, and knowing what's at stake." "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "When someone like Jenkins makes a bad call, it's not just about him. It's about the people who get caught in the fallout. Today, that was you. and I wasn't going to let you take the hit for his mistakes. Sarah's eyes softened. Thanks, Dad. Marcus smiled. Anytime, kiddo. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. At the school, Jenkins sat alone in his office, the hum of the building quieting his staff and students left for the day. He stared at the empty desk in front of him, his thoughts heavy with regret. He had always prided himself on being decisive, but today had shown him the difference between decisiveness and carelessness. For the first time in a long while, he felt the uncomfortable sting of self-reflection. Pulling out a notepad, Jenkins began jotting down ideas. Notes on how the school could better handle conflicts, how to implement diversity training, and ways to ensure that students like Sarah wouldn't be judged unfairly again. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, the sun poured through the windows as Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, smoothing out her hair. There was a tightness in her chest, but it wasn't the same dread she had felt yesterday. Today, there was something new, a quiet resolve. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Ready for your first day back? Sarah glanced at her reflection, then turned toward him with a small smile. Yeah, I think I am. Marcus smiled, a rare softness in his expression. That's my girl. When they arrived at the school, Marcus insisted on walking her in, even though Sarah insisted she was fine. Come on, Dad, she groaned, though the corners of her mouth twitched with amusement. You already won the battle. Do you really need to escort me to class? Marcus raised an eyebrow, unbothered. I'm not taking any chances. They entered the building together, and as Sarah expected, the stares and whispers picked up immediately. But something was different today. Instead of feeling crushed under the weight of everyone's attention, Sarah held her head high. Mrs. Alvarez greeted them at the front desk, visibly more relaxed today than she had been the day before. Good morning, Miss Williams. Welcome back. She gave Marcus a polite, almost sheepish nod. Everything's been cleared from the system. Appreciate it, Marcus said with a curt nod. Thanks, Sarah added quietly before they moved down the hall together. At her locker, Sarah noticed a small group of students huddled nearby, whispering behind their hands as they shot her curious glances. Normally, that kind of attention would have made her stomach twist in knots. But today, she just smiled to herself. Let them talk. Before Marcus could head back to the car, Principal Jenkins appeared at the end of the hallway, walking toward them with measured steps. Sarah tensed slightly, but Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Good morning, Jenkins said, his expression neutral but less rigid than before. He glanced at Sarah, his gaze steady. I wanted to personally apologize, Miss Williams. What happened shouldn't have, and I take full responsibility. Sarah blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you, she said softly. I'm also scheduling a meeting with the school board to discuss changes to our disciplinary policies, Jenkins continued. And I'll be organizing a series of training sessions for the staff on bias awareness. This won't happen again. Marcus gave a slow nod, recognizing the effort behind Jenkins' words. It wasn't just an apology, it was an attempt to be better. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, then offered his hand to Marcus. Thank you for holding me accountable, he said quietly. I needed that. Marcus took the handshake, firm but respectful. We all have things to work on. Jenkins nodded once more, then turned to Sarah. I hope you'll feel comfortable here again. If there's anything I can do to help, my door is open. Sarah gave him a small but genuine smile. I appreciate that. With a nod, Jenkins excused himself, leaving Marcus and Sarah standing by her locker. Marcus tilted his head toward the classroom. You good? Sarah nodded, a new sense of confidence settling in her chest. Yeah, I'm good. Marcus gave her shoulder one last squeeze. All right then, go show them what you're made of. Back in the car, Marcus sat for a moment, staring out the windshield with a thoughtful expression. This wasn't the first time he'd had to confront people in positions of power, but this time felt different. He thought about Jenkins, the mistakes he had made, and the effort he was now making to change. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Marcus knew better than anyone that change wasn't instant. It was slow, uncomfortable, and sometimes painful, but it was worth fighting for. With one last glance toward the school, Marcus smiled to himself, knowing that Sarah would be just fine. She had faced humiliation, unfairness, and judgment, but she had come out stronger on the other side. And that, to Marcus, was what mattered most. That evening, the house was filled with the sounds of life again. Sarah playing music softly in her room, Marcus clattering dishes in the kitchen as he cooked dinner. For the first time in days, the air felt light, free of tension. As they sat down to eat, Sarah looked across the table at her father, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thanks for standing up for me, Dad," she said softly. Marcus gave her a warm smile. "Always." They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, the kind only shared by people who know they're safe with each other. After a while, Sarah leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you think Jenkins will really change?" Marcus took a sip of water, considering the question. "I think he's starting. But change is a choice you have to make every day." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. "And what if he doesn't?" Marcus smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Then people like you and me will be there to remind him." The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, misunderstandings, and unfair situations to navigate. But now, she knew she wasn't alone. She had her father's strength and her own growing confidence. And, most importantly, she had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about fighting, it was about knowing her worth. And that, she realized, was a lesson no one could take away from her. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, sipping his coffee as the sun rose over the neighborhood. The day stretched ahead, full of possibilities. He knew the fight for fairness wasn't over. Not for Sarah, not for himself, and not for people like them. But he also knew that every conversation, every confrontation, every small victory added up. And for now, that was enough.